Think for Yourself is one of those songs that lands right in that sweet spot between the Beatles' raw beginnings and their more introspective, experimental phase. Written by George Harrison for Rubber Soul, it showcases his growing songwriting chops at a time when the band was eager to shed their image as pop heartthrobs and embrace deeper ideas. George himself said he wasn't quite sure who he was writing about. He vaguely pointed to probably the government years later. But that ambiguity has kept people guessing for decades about whether he was taking a shot at politics, personal relationships, or both. There's no question that the Beatles were evolving. They'd been spending time with Bob Dylan by then, who was one of their major influences. His wit and candor clearly encouraged them to tackle more substantial topics. For George, that meant thinking outside the classic boy meets girl formula. It almost feels like George was putting down a marker on independence and self-awareness, themes the Beatles would continue to revisit. Musically, the song is a bit of a departure from their usual fare. One standout feature is Paul McCartney's fuzzed-out bass, a sound that was fresh and gritty for the time. The fuzz effect came from a device called the tone bender, which had only recently been introduced. This was the first time the Beatles recorded bass with a fuzz box, giving the song a rougher, almost snarling edge. There's something about that fuzz bass that adds tension to George's lyrics, like he's deliberately making his stance bolder, more defiant. This sort of fierce-sounding tone helped to create the song's vibe of self-assured independence with a sound that commanded attention. Later, McCartney would use the same fuzz effect on Abbey Road's Mean Mr. Mustard, but this was where it all started. The band was under a serious deadline to finish the album, yet there's still a lightheartedness that comes through. They even recorded a kind of goofy rehearsal tape that captured their studio banter, their humor, and some casual asides that never made it onto the Christmas fan club disc they were working on at the same time. At the time of its release, the song's lyrics struck some critics as ambiguous. Is this about politics, love, or both? Was the common question. Lines like, "I left you far behind," and "the things that you do," were just vague enough to allow listeners to interpret it their own way, whether as a kiss-off to a toxic relationship or a subtle jab at government hypocrisy. In a lot of ways, Think for Yourself is a kind of anti-love song, hinting at the distance and disillusionment with convention that was bubbling under the surface for the Beatles. Over the years, this song has become more appreciated for its raw honesty and George's approach to thinking independently, something we'd come to see more from him as he delved into Eastern philosophy and spirituality. Critics looking back often mention how this track, alongside If I Needed Someone, paved the way for Harrison's development as a songwriter, one who'd moved beyond the Lennon-McCartney shadow. When Rubber Soul dropped, the world was just starting to understand who these guys in the band really were. They were artists on a journey, both musically and personally, challenging themselves and their audience to think deeper and live bolder.